in front of hundreds of shareholders and media cameras at Harrison Corp's 30th anniversary gala, the cold-eyed CEO looked at the man holding a small boy in his arms and smiled. "If you can dance this tango with me, I'll marry you." The ballroom erupted in laughter, a single dad in worn work clothes clearly out of place among the elite. But when he set his son down, removed his old shoes, and stepped onto the dance floor, the laughter died. What made a proud CEO issue such a challenge? And why would she be the one most changed by this dance? 3 hours before the gala began, Ethan Mitchell stood in the service corridor of the Harrison Corp Grand Ballroom, adjusting his maintenance uniform. His 5-year-old son Lucas sat on an overturned crate nearby, swinging his legs and clutching a red balloon that one of the catering staff had given him. Ethan had not planned to bring his son to work, but the babysitter canceled at the last minute, and he could not afford to miss this shift. Tonight was the 30th anniversary celebration of Harrison Corp, and every temporary worker had been called in. For Ethan, it was more than just a paycheck. He had spent 8 months working his way into this company, taking any job they would give him, waiting for the right moment to find what he was looking for. His wife Grace had died 3 years ago. She was a ballet dancer, talented and full of light, and they had performed together across the world before settling down to start a family. Then came the accident. A car ran a red light and struck her as she crossed the street after leaving a Harrison Corp company event, where she had been hired to perform. The driver was never publicly identified. The case was settled quietly out of court, and Ethan was offered a sum of money to sign papers and stay silent. He refused. He sold their apartment, packed up their life, and disappeared with Lucas. But he never stopped searching for the truth. Every lead pointed back to Harrison Corp, to something buried deep within the company's records. Tonight, the ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and champagne towers. Men in tailored suits and women in designer gowns filled the space, their laughter echoing off marble floors. Ethan moved through the crowd, invisibly collecting empty glasses and adjusting flower arrangements. Lucas stayed hidden in the service area, under strict instructions not to wander. But a 5-year-old's attention span has limits, and when his red balloon slipped from his fingers and floated toward the main floor, he chased after it without thinking. The balloon drifted across the dance floor just as the orchestra finished a piece. Lucas ran after it, weaving between guests, his small shoes squeaking on the polished marble. He did not see the man stepping backward until it was too late. The collision was minor, but the reaction was not. Richard Vance, a senior board member with silver hair and a permanent sneer, stumbled and spilled champagne down the front of his $3,000 jacket. His face twisted with fury as he looked down at the small boy frozen in fear before him. Richard grabbed Lucas by the arm, his grip too tight, his voice too loud. "Where did this street rat come from? Who let a child into this event?" Ethan heard his son cry out and moved before he could think. He crossed the ballroom floor in seconds, placing himself between Richard and Lucas, gently but firmly removing the man's hand from his son's arm. "I apologize for the disruption. He's my son. It won't happen again." His voice was calm, controlled, but his eyes held something that made Richard take a half step back before anger replaced surprise. Richard straightened his jacket and raised his voice so the nearby guests could hear. "Your son. And who exactly are you?" "One of the cleaning staff, I assume. Do you have any idea who I am? I want this man fired immediately. Someone call security." The commotion drew attention from across the room. Guests turned to watch conversations dying as the scene unfolded. Ethan kept his hand on Lucas's shoulder, keeping his son behind him, keeping his expression neutral even as the humiliation burned. He had survived worse. He had buried his wife and rebuilt his life from nothing. He would not break in front of these people. An elderly gentleman near the edge of the crowd squinted at Ethan, recognition flickering across his weathered face. He leaned toward his companion and whispered, "That man looks familiar." like the dancer from that Buenos Aires performance years ago, the one who used to perform with his wife. Isabella Harrison descended the grand staircase at precisely that moment. She had been watching the disturbance from the mezzanine level, calculating the best approach to contain the situation before it became a media incident. At 30 years old, she was the youngest CEO in Harrison Corp's history, having inherited the position from her father 2 years prior. She wore a black evening gown that cost more than most people earned in a month, her dark hair pulled back in a severe style that matched her reputation. The board called her cold. The media called her untouchable. She called herself practical. Love was a liability, trust was a weakness, and control was everything. She had learned these lessons watching her parents' marriage implode in a spectacular display of betrayal and public scandal. She approached the scene with measured steps, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome. Richard turned to her with an expectant smile, certain she would support his demand. "Miss Harrison, I was just explaining to security that this employee needs to be removed, along with his child. This kind of incompetence reflects poorly on the entire organization." Isabella looked at Richard, then at the maintenance worker standing before her. She expected to see fear, desperation, perhaps tears. Instead, she found steady eyes that met hers without flinching. He was not handsome in the conventional way, but there was something in his stillness that caught her attention. He held his son's hand with a gentleness that contrasted with the tension in his jaw. He was waiting, but not for permission, not for mercy, just waiting to see what she would do. The moment stretched between them, and Isabella felt an unfamiliar sensation, like losing her footing on solid ground. She did not like it. Richard continued his tirade, suggesting various punishments, demanding apologies, playing to the crowd that had gathered. A few guests laughed nervously. Someone made a comment about the help not knowing their place. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and something shifted in Isabella's expression. Perhaps it was the way Ethan refused to look away. Perhaps it was the small boy clutching his father's hand with absolute trust. Perhaps it was simply the need to regain control of a situation that had somehow slipped beyond her grasp. She raised her hand, and the ballroom fell silent. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the gathered crowd, cool and precise. "Mr. Vance, I believe you've made your point. Though I'm curious why a spilled drink requires such theatrics." Richard's face reddened, but before he could respond, Isabella turned to Ethan. Her eyes traced the lines of his face, searching for something she could not name. The orchestra had been preparing for the next piece, a tango, and the opening notes began to drift across the ballroom. Isabella heard herself speak before she had fully formed the thought. "You seem remarkably composed for someone in your position. Tell me, can you dance?" Ethan's expression did not change. "I can." The answer was simple, without pride or false modesty, and it irritated her in a way she did not expect. Isabella smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. She gestured toward the empty dance floor, then spoke loudly enough for every guest and every camera to capture her words. "Then let's make this interesting. If you can dance this tango with me, I'll marry you." Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was the perfect joke, a billionaire CEO humbling herself to challenge a maintenance worker, knowing the outcome was predetermined. He would stumble, embarrass himself, and slink away while she demonstrated her magnanimity by not having him fired. Richard Vance smiled with satisfaction, already anticipating the humiliation. But Ethan did not react to the laughter. He looked down at Lucas, who stared up at him with wide, worried eyes. The boy had seen his father retreat from the world for 3 years, had watched him shrink himself small to fit into spaces where no one would notice him. Ethan knelt down until he was eye level with his son. "Can you wait for me right here? Just for a few minutes. I promise I'll come right back." Lucas nodded slowly, his small hand releasing his father's. "Okay, Daddy." Ethan stood and removed his worn work shoes, setting them neatly beside his son. Then he stepped onto the dance floor in his socks, facing Isabella Harrison, across 6 feet of polished marble. His voice was quiet, but clear. "If I dance, your words won't be a joke. Are you willing to accept that?" Isabella's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. No one had ever responded to her challenges with conditions of their own. She should have dismissed him, ended this farce before it went any further. Instead, she heard herself answer, "Fine. Show me what you can do." The orchestra began the tango, and Ethan extended his hand toward Isabella. She took it, expecting hesitation, expecting the rough grip of a man out of his depth. Instead, his fingers closed around hers with practiced precision, firm but not forceful, guiding her into position with an ease that sent a small shock through her system. His other hand settled on her back, and before she could adjust her expectations, they were moving. Ethan did not dance like a man trying to prove something. He danced like a man remembering who he used to be. Every step was deliberate, every turn controlled, every movement flowing into the next, with the kind of mastery that took years to develop. He led Isabella across the floor, as if the ballroom had emptied, as if the watching crowds and flashing cameras had dissolved into nothing. His eyes held hers throughout, and for the first time in her adult life, Isabella found herself following instead of leading. Her body responded to his guidance before her mind could object, turning when he turned, stepping where he directed, falling into a rhythm she had never learned, but somehow already knew. The laughter in the ballroom died within the first 8 counts. By the time they reached the first dramatic pause of the tango, silence had spread across the entire room like a held breath. Guests who had been smirking into their champagne glasses now stood motionless, watching the impossible unfold before them. The maintenance worker in his wrinkled uniform moved like liquid fire across the marble floor, and the Ice Queen CEO melted into his arms with each passing measure. Richard Vance's satisfied smile had frozen into something closer to horror. The elderly gentleman who had recognized Ethan earlier nodded slowly to himself, his suspicion confirmed. Isabella felt her heart pounding against her ribs in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the dance. She had attended galas and charity balls since childhood, had learned ballroom dancing from private instructors, had performed adequate waltzes with suitable partners at countless events, but she had never experienced anything like this. Ethan's gaze never wavered from hers, and in his eyes, she saw something that terrified her far more than any boardroom confrontation or hostile takeover. She saw someone who truly saw her, not the CEO, not the Harrison heir, not the untouchable woman in the designer gown, just her. The tango built toward its crescendo, and Ethan guided Isabella through the final sequence with the precision of a master and the emotion of a man dancing with ghosts. When the last note faded, they stood frozen in the final pose, his arm around her waist, her hand on his shoulder, both of them breathing harder than the dance alone could explain. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds before the ballroom erupted. Not in laughter this time, but in stunned applause that grew from scattered clapping to a thunderous ovation. Ethan released Isabella, slowly stepped back, and gave her a small bow that somehow managed to be both humble and dignified. Then he turned, walked back to where Lucas waited, lifted his son into his arms, and left the ballroom without another word. Isabella stood alone on the dance floor, surrounded by applause. She barely heard her carefully constructed world, suddenly full of cracks she could not explain. By the time she recovered enough to look for him, Ethan Mitchell had vanished into the service corridors from which he came. The video went viral before midnight. Someone had captured the entire dance on their phone and posted it with the caption, "CEO promises to marry mystery dancer." Within hours, it had been shared across every social media platform, picked up by entertainment news outlets, and dissected by morning talk shows. The hashtag Tango proposal trended worldwide. Isabella's phone exploded with calls from board members, investors, and her personal publicist, all demanding to know how she planned to handle the situation. Her engagement to Marcus Chen, son of their primary merger partner, was supposed to be announced at next month's shareholder meeting. The strategic marriage had been negotiated for over a year, a business arrangement designed to seal a billion-dollar deal. Now that arrangement was threatened by a 3-minute dance with a man whose name she did not even know. Isabella spent the next 48 hours in damage control mode, issuing carefully worded statements about the incident being a light-hearted moment taken out of context. But the public was not interested in corporate spin. They wanted the love story. They wanted the fairy tale of the powerful CEO brought to her knees by a mysterious stranger. And they wanted to know who he was. Isabella wanted to know too, though she told herself it was purely for strategic reasons. She needed to understand the threat before she could neutralize it. Her security team delivered a file to her office 3 days after the gala. Ethan Mitchell, age 32, former professional tango dancer, widower, father of 1. His wife, Grace, had been a ballet dancer of considerable talent, and together they had performed at venues across South America and Europe before retiring from the circuit to start a family. The file included photographs from their performing days, images of a younger Ethan in tailored suits holding a beautiful woman in his arms on stages from Buenos Aires to Paris. Isabella studied the photos for longer than necessary, telling herself she was looking for useful information. Grace Mitchell had died 3 years ago in a hit-and-run accident. The driver was never publicly identified. The case was settled out of court. Something about that detail nagged at Isabella, a small thorn of unease that she could not quite identify. She dug deeper, pulling records she probably should not have accessed, making calls to people who owed her favors. The picture that emerged made her stomach turn. Grace Mitchell had been struck by a car belonging to a Harrison Corp executive after performing at a company event. The driver had been intoxicated, having left a private party celebrating a successful quarterly report. Isabella's father had handled the situation personally, burying the incident under layers of legal agreements and financial settlements to protect the company's upcoming IPO. The executive responsible had never faced charges, never lost his position, never suffered any consequences beyond a temporary reassignment. His name was Richard Vance. Isabella read the file 3 times, hoping she had misunderstood, hoping there was some other explanation. But the evidence was clear. The man who had humiliated Ethan at the gala, who had grabbed his son and demanded his termination, was the same man who had killed his wife and walked away untouched. And her father had made it possible. Harrison Corp. The company she had inherited with such pride, the legacy she had sworn to protect, was built on a foundation that included covering up manslaughter to preserve stock prices. She thought about the way Ethan had looked at her during the dance, the steadiness in his eyes, the complete absence of hatred or bitterness. He had known. He must have known who she was, what her family had done. And still, he had danced with her as if she were the only person in the room. She found him 2 days later at a small apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The building was old but clean, the kind of place where working families stretched tight budgets and looked out for each other's children. Isabella arrived without her driver, without her security detail, wearing jeans and a simple sweater that cost more than most of the cars in the parking lot. She knocked on the door of Unit 314 and waited. Ethan opened the door with Lucas on his hip, both of them clearly in the middle of dinner. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by the same guarded calm she remembered from the gala. "Miss Harrison." His voice was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. Isabella realized she had not planned what to say, had not prepared a script for this conversation. "I know about Grace. I know what Richard Vance did. I know what my other covered up." The words came out harder than she intended, and she saw Ethan's grip tighten slightly on his son. Lucas looked between his father and the strange woman at the door with open curiosity. Ethan set the boy down gently. "Lucas, can you finish your carrots in your room? I'll be there in a minute." The child nodded and padded away, glancing back once, before disappearing down the hall. Ethan stepped onto the small landing outside his apartment, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that it would not carry inside. "Why are you here to apologize, to offer money? Your father already tried that." Isabella shook her head. "I'm here because I need to understand. You could have destroyed us. You could have gone to the press, hired lawyers, torn Harrison Corp apart. Why didn't you?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Because my son needs a father, not a man consumed by revenge. Because Grace would have wanted me to build something, not burn everything down. And because I knew that eventually the truth would find its way out." He leaned against the railing, suddenly looking more tired than a 32-year-old should. "I took this job because I wanted answers. I wanted to know who was driving that car, who made the decision to make it all disappear. I thought if I found proof, I could do something with it. But proof doesn't bring her back. It doesn't give Lucas his mother. It just keeps me stuck in the worst moment of my life." Isabella felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she had spent years constructing. "What do you want? If it's not revenge, if it's not money, what do you actually want?" Ethan's answer was simple. "I want my son to grow up without being ashamed of his father. I want him to know that I didn't stay silent because I was afraid or because I was bought. I stayed quiet because I was trying to figure out how to live again. But I can't keep living in hiding forever. Eventually, I have to choose. Keep protecting myself or stand up and tell the truth, whatever that costs." The conversation lasted almost an hour. They sat on the concrete steps of the apartment building while the sun set over the parking lot, talking about grief and guilt and the impossible weight of legacies they never asked for. Isabella told him about her parents' divorce, about watching her mother destroy herself with bitterness, while her father buried himself in work and secrets. Ethan told her about the early days after Grace died, when he could barely get out of bed, when Lucas would crawl into his arms and pat his face with tiny hands, asking when Mommy was coming home. By the time Isabella left, something had shifted between them. Not quite trust, but the possibility of it. A door cracked open that neither of them had expected. The following weeks became a complicated dance of their own. The board of directors pressured Isabella to finalize the merger agreement and announce her engagement to Marcus Chen. Richard Vance, sensing that something had changed in Isabella's demeanor toward him, began making veiled threats about revealing her father's involvement in the cover-up if she did not fall in line. The walls were closing in from every direction, and Isabella found herself spending more and more time in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, watching a man teach his son how to dance in their tiny living room. Ethan had started dancing again, not professionally, not publicly, but in the quiet evenings, after Lucas finished his homework, they would push the furniture aside and practice together. Sometimes Isabella joined them, learning basic steps, while Lucas giggled at her mistakes. She was terrible at following, too accustomed to being in control, too rigid in her movements to surrender to the music. But she kept trying, and slowly, awkwardly, she began to improve. More importantly, she began to understand. The tango was not about domination or submission. It was about trust, about two people moving together towards something neither could achieve alone. The crisis came 6 weeks after the gala. Richard Vance called an emergency board meeting, claiming to have evidence of financial irregularities that required immediate attention. Isabella knew it was a trap, knew he was maneuvering to force her hand on the merger. She also knew she could not avoid it forever. The night before the meeting, she sat in Ethan's apartment, while Lucas slept in the next room. They had not defined what they were to each other, had not put words to the connection that had grown between them. But when Isabella told him she was considering exposing everything destroying her own company, to finally bring the truth to light. Ethan did not try to stop her. He simply asked if she was sure. "I don't know how to be sure of anything anymore," she admitted. 6 weeks ago, I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. Now I look at Harrison Corp, and all I see is lies stacked on lies. I look at the life I was supposed to live, the marriage I was supposed to make, and it feels like a prison sentence. I look at you, and I don't know what I see, but it's the only thing that feels real." Ethan reached across the small space between them and took her hand. "Then be real. Whatever that means, whatever it costs. Lucas and I survived losing everything once. We can do it again if we have to. But you have to decide what kind of person you want to be, not what kind of CEO, not what kind of Harrison, just you." The next morning, Ethan packed 2 suitcases. He told Lucas they might be going on a trip somewhere new, somewhere they could start over. The boy accepted this with the adaptability of children who have already survived impossible things. They were ready to leave the city, to disappear again, to let Isabella fight her own battles without the complication of their presence. But before they could reach the door, Ethan's phone buzzed with a news alert. Isabella Harrison was speaking at an emergency press conference, and the headline made him set down the suitcases and turn on the television. She stood at a podium in the Harrison Corp lobby, surrounded by reporters and cameras and the shocked faces of board members who had not been warned about what was coming. Richard Vance stood near the back of the room, his expression shifting from smug confidence to dawning horror as Isabella began to speak. She told them everything. The accident, the cover-up, her father's role, Richard's guilt. She presented documents and records evidence she had spent weeks secretly compiling. She announced the cancellation of the merger agreement and her refusal to enter into a strategic marriage built on lies. She acknowledged that this would likely cost her the company, her position, her reputation, everything she had spent her life building. And then she said something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. 3 years ago, an innocent woman died because of decisions made by this company. Her name was Grace Mitchell. She was a dancer, a mother, a wife. And the man who loved her has spent 3 years searching for justice, while we spent 3 years protecting ourselves. That ends today. I don't know if I can fix what was broken. I don't know if Harrison Corp deserves to survive this, but I know that I would rather lose everything than continue building on a foundation of someone else's grief. The aftermath was chaos. Richard Vance was escorted out by security facing immediate investigation. The board voted to remove Isabella from her position as CEO, citing breach of fiduciary duty and conduct unbecoming of leadership. Stock prices plummeted. Lawyers descended like vultures. Isabella Harrison went from being one of the most powerful women in business to a cautionary tale in less than 24 hours. And Ethan Mitchell unpacked his suitcases. The weeks following Isabella's press conference blurred together in a haze of legal proceedings and media scrutiny. She moved out of her penthouse apartment and into a modest rental on the other side of the city, unable to afford the maintenance fees once her assets were frozen, pending shareholder lawsuits. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms and dictated market trends now spent her days meeting with lawyers, signing documents, and watching the empire her family had built crumble piece by piece. Richard Vance was arrested and charged with vehicular manslaughter, the statute of limitations having not yet expired, thanks to the original cover-up that had prevented any formal investigation. Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Ethan stayed in the city. He had planned to leave, had been ready to start over somewhere new, but something kept him anchored. Lucas had developed a fever the day after Isabella's announcement. Nothing serious, just a childhood illness that required rest and attention. By the time the boy recovered, 2 weeks had passed, and leaving felt less urgent than it had before. Ethan found work at a local community center, teaching dance classes to seniors and children who could not afford private instruction. The pay was minimal, but it was honest work, and for the first time in 3 years, he was dancing again. Not hiding, not pretending, not surviving. Actually living. Lucas asked about Isabella often. The boy had grown attached to the woman who visited their apartment and stumbled through dance steps in their living room. He did not understand the complexities of what had happened, only that the nice lady who made his father smile had stopped coming around. One evening, while Ethan was helping him with a simple reading exercise, Lucas looked up from his book with a question that cut straight through all of Ethan's careful defenses. "Daddy, the lady who danced with you at the party, does she know how to dance now?" Ethan set down the book and considered his answer carefully. "She's learning. She wasn't very good at first, but she kept trying." Lucas nodded seriously, processing this information with the gravity that only a 5-year-old can muster. "That's good. Mommy always said trying is the most important part." The mention of Grace hit Ethan like it always did, a sudden weight in his chest that never fully went away. But this time, there was something else mixed in with the grief, something that felt almost like hope. Lucas continued, his small voice thoughtful. "Daddy, would Mommy be happy if you danced again? Like really danced, not just teaching?" Ethan felt his eyes burn with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in years. He pulled his son close and held him for a long moment before answering. "Yeah, buddy, I think she would be." Isabella arrived at Ethan's apartment 3 weeks after her world collapsed. She came without warning, carrying a small cardboard box that looked out of place in her arms. She had lost weight, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. But there was also something different about her, a softness in her posture that had not been there before, as if the armor she had worn her entire life had finally been set aside. Ethan opened the door and simply stepped back to let her in. No questions, asked no demands for explanation. Lucas was at a neighbor's apartment for a playdate, giving them privacy. Neither had requested, but both seemed to need. Isabella set the box on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment, looking around the small apartment, as if seeing it for the first time. "I found something in my father's files, something he kept hidden even from the lawyers." She opened the box and pulled out a folder thick with documents. Original evidence from the accident, police reports that were never filed, witness statements that were buried. Everything you would need to build a case against Richard Vance that goes beyond just the manslaughter charge. She pushed the folder across the table toward Ethan. "This should have been yours 3 years ago. I can't undo what my family did to you, but I can give you this. The right to speak, the right to be heard, the right to get justice for Grace on your own terms." Ethan looked at the folder, but did not touch it. Instead, he looked at Isabella, studying her face the way he had studied her during their dance, searching for something beneath the surface. "Why did you really come here? You could have sent a lawyer. You could have mailed this to me. Why show up in person?" Isabella's composure cracked slightly, a tremor passing through her carefully controlled expression. "Because I needed to see you. Because for the past 3 weeks, I've been losing everything I thought mattered, and the only thing I could think about was a man who danced with me like I was the only person in the world. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything at all, but I couldn't stay away." Ethan crossed the small kitchen and took her hands in his. They were shaking slightly, whether from cold or fear or something else entirely. "Do you know why I accepted your challenge that night? It wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving anything to Richard Vance or the people laughing at me." He looked into her eyes with the same intensity that had undone her on the dance floor. "It was because, for the first time in 3 years, someone looked at me like I was worth fighting. Not worth pitying. Not worth helping. Worth challenging. You saw me as an equal, even when you were trying to humiliate me. And I hadn't felt that way since Grace died." Isabella's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I was trying to protect myself. I saw something in your eyes that scared me, something that made me feel out of control. The challenge was supposed to put you in your place, remind us both of the distance between our worlds. Instead, it destroyed every wall I had ever built. Ethan released her hands and stepped back, not in rejection, but in invitation. I need time. Lucas needs stability. And you need to figure out who you are without Harrison Corp, without the money, without the power. I can't be the answer to questions you haven't finished asking. Isabella nodded, accepting the truth of his words even as they stung. I know. I didn't come here expecting anything. I just needed you to have these documents. And I needed to tell you that whatever happens next, I don't regret the choice I made. Losing everything was worth it, if only because it finally made me feel like myself. She turned to leave, but Ethan's voice stopped her at the door. Isabella, the community center where I teach, they're having a small showcase next month. Nothing fancy, just students performing what they've learned. Lucas will be there. He hesitated, then continued. You could come if you wanted, as a guest. No expectations, no pressure. Just two people watching children dance badly and pretending it's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen. A small smile crossed Isabella's face, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the night of the gala. I'd like that. The months that followed were quiet ones, filled with small moments rather than grand gestures. Isabella sold what remained of her personal assets and used the money to establish a foundation supporting families affected by drunk driving accidents. It was not enough to erase the past, but it was a start. She attended the community center showcase and sat in the back row watching Lucas perform a simple waltz with a girl twice his size, both of them counting steps out loud and laughing when they stumbled. Ethan caught her eye across the room and nodded, once as a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than words. The second tango happened 4 months after the first. It was not at a grand gala or in front of cameras and shareholders. It was in the small studio where Ethan had first learned to dance, the same studio where he had met Grace 15 years earlier. The space had been rented for the evening, filled with a handful of old friends, a few students from the community center, and one 5-year-old boy who insisted on sitting in the front row with a juice box and a very serious expression. Isabella had spent the past 4 months taking private lessons not to prove anything to anyone, but because she wanted to understand the world that had shaped the man she could not stop thinking about. When the music began, she was the one who extended her hand first. Ethan took it, and they moved together across the worn wooden floor with none of the tension that had marked their first dance. This time, there was no audience to impress, no point to prove, no walls to maintain. Just two people who had lost everything and found something unexpected in the wreckage. When the dance ended, Isabella did not wait for applause or acknowledgement. She simply looked at Ethan and spoke the words she had been carrying for months. The first time I challenged you to prove you were worthy of me, I was wrong. I was so completely wrong. She took a breath, steadying herself. This time I'm asking if you'll let me try to be worthy of you, not as a CEO or a Harrison, just as someone who wants to learn how to follow, how to trust, how to build something real instead of just protecting what I inherited. Ethan looked at his son, who was watching with wide eyes and a milk mustache from his juice box. Lucas gave a small, enthusiastic nod, and Ethan felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 long years. I don't need you to marry me because of a promise you made at a party, he said quietly. But if you want to keep dancing, I can teach you a few more steps. Isabella laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound Ethan had heard since the last time Grace had laughed, in their tiny kitchen flower, in her hair, and love in her eyes. I think I'd like that very much. Lucas abandoned his juice box and ran to them, wrapping his small arms around both their legs in a hug that nearly toppled all 3 of them. The studio lights were warm, the music had faded, and somewhere in the space between what was lost and what might still be found, a new story was just beginning.